On August 14, 2006, a letter from the Executive Director of Human Rights Watch stated that the Sudanese government is both incapable of protecting its own citizens in Darfur and unwilling to do so. The letter added that the country's militias were guilty of crimes against humanity and that these human rights abuses have existed since 2004. Fast forward to today, Sudan is still knee-deep in internal conflicts, with over 4 million citizens displaced within their own country being automatic victims of a never-ending cycle of war and violence. For most Sudanese, conflict is all they know. Only a few percentage of them ever knew about the time there was peace, with no fear of what conflict tomorrow holds. This video is about the story of an average Sudanese who has lived an average lifespan of a human in the world today, 74 years. Their journey from being born in peace to hanging by a thread from a life filled with conflicts and civil wars. For the purpose of our narration, let's call our average Sudanese Asifa, born in the Darfur region in 1952. She would have belonged to the Four Tribe, a Western Sudanese people practicing sedentary herding and active agriculture. The news in the air was the Egyptian revolution from the British monarchy, and Mohamed Naguib, who was Egypt's first president and half Sudanese, made it a priority to secure Sudanese independence. The British agreed to terminate their sovereignty over Sudan, and in 1953, the monarchy was abolished. By 1st January 1956, Sudan became an independent state, with Ismail al-Zahari elected the first prime minister. At the People's Palace, the Egyptian and British flags were lowered and the new Sudanese flag was raised in their place by Ismail al-Zahari. This would have marked the beginning of a new era and hope for Asifa's family and Sudanese everywhere. Unknown to them, it would be the end of a peaceful era and the beginning of a life filled with terror, conflict, war, and survival. Oh yeah, before we get lost in this story, support us by liking this video and hitting the subscribe button for video essays, armchair documentaries, and stories like this. So let's delve right into Asifa's story. While the independence agreement was still in the air, conflicts between the northern and southern parts of Sudan were brewing. At 3 years old, Asifa would have started living in a warring nation, the beginning of life full of wars and conflicts. The first Sudanese civil war was known as the Anyanya Rebellion, began in 1955 through to 1972. The cause of the war was that the southern region was demanding representation and more regional autonomy. They claimed they were virtually powerless within the newly established government and could not address the injustice against their people due to the minimal influence and support they had within the government. The civil war resulted in about 1 million deaths for the 17-year-long war. In the middle of the war, dissatisfaction with the government by the army generals was brewing, which eventually erupted into a coup d'etat in 25th of May 1969, led by Gafar Nimeri, who became the next prime minister. Gafar Nimeri started an Islamist rule that led to the rebellion from the south. With pre-existing differences in language, political power, and beliefs, the Islamist rule further heightened the civil unrest between the north and the south, mainly due to differences in religion. In 1972, Asifa would have been excited to finally welcome peace because of the Addis Ababa Agreement. This agreement led to the end of the North-South Civil War, but unfortunately also the end of the American investment in the Janjaweed Canal project. This project was started to divert water from the Sud wetlands into the south to irrigate the Upper Nile region and to prevent wide-scale famine and environmental catastrophe. Basically, as the bloody war raged on for almost 20 years, Asifa's family would have experienced raiding, looting, burning of their properties, and murdering of their tribesmen, and now severe famine. By the time Asifa was 37 years of age, Omar al-Bashir led a bloodless coup and became the ruler of Sudan, leading a 30-year-long military dictatorship all through to 2019. At the same time, civil unrest had resurfaced between the north and the south, as the Addis Ababa Agreement failed to completely douse the tensions. A second civil war began and lasted from 1989 until 2005. The war was mainly between the National Islamic Front (NIF) and the Sudan People's Liberation Army (SPLA), which eventually led to the independence of South Sudan in 2011. Despite the widespread human rights abuses committed by Bashir, like the persecution of minorities, alleged sponsorship of global terrorism, and torture of Sudanese people, none would directly impact Asifa and her family like the ethnic genocide in Darfur. Asifa would have wondered what her father would have said when the government came for the people of the Darfur region. He had died in the early years of the Second Sudanese Civil War alongside thousands of Sudanese whose lives were claimed by the war. He would have believed all would be well and they would return to their peaceful lives. At this time, Asifa would have no belief left in her, especially not with a government incapable and unwilling to protect its citizens. All that would have been left of her was survival for herself and her 2 children, doing everything to protect her son from being taken away as a child soldier. In February 2003, the Sudan Liberation Movement /Army and Justice and Equality Movement groups in Darfur claimed that the government oppressed non-Arab Sudanese in favor of Sudanese Arabs. These groups took up arms to face the opposition. The government unleashed a local Arab nomad militia called Janjaweed, who attacked people village by village in a campaign of terror. They shouted racial slurs like, "Kill all the slaves, kill the blacks, we will kill all men and rape the women. We want to change the color." This gave rise to the war in Darfur, resulting in over 400 villages being burned. The conflict has since been described as the Darfur Genocide, and the International Criminal Court issued 2 arrest warrants for Bashir. Asifa and her children would have been forced to flee their homes to hide in displacement camps where food and water were scarce. The camps were unsafe as explosives continuously rained down on the camps. One day, a fragment would tear through her son's abdomen and she would watch him bleed to death. In March 2007, a report from the US State Department's Human Rights attributed part of the violations to the rebels as well as the government and the Janjaweed. The report claimed that all parties committed serious abuses, including widespread killing of civilians, rape as a tool of war, systematic torture, robbery, and recruitment of child soldiers. It was estimated that Bashir's regime killed about 300,000 to 400,000 people, with over 2.8 million civilians being displaced. In a desperate struggle for survival, Asifa would have moved to Khartoum, considering the country's capital was relatively safe at the time. Years of moving from one displacement camp to another would have pushed Asifa to acquire different skills. An example would be textile making just to make ends meet. Even though the conflict in Darfur had not settled down, Asifa would have been determined to look forward and start a new life in Khartoum, starting a textile business with her daughter. Despite the economic hardship caused by internal instability, violence, isolation, and international sanctions, Asifa was still resolved to survive. Her hope would have lived an abbreviated life when a brief war ensued in 2012. Shortly after Southern Sudan's independence in 2011, Sudan and South Sudan fought over oil-rich regions like Abyei located between the 2 countries. It was called Eglig Crisis. The hardship in Sudan increased and the people revolted against Bashir's 30-year-long dictatorship, especially after his refusal to step down. Bashir had decided to triple the price of goods at a period when the country suffered an acute shortage of foreign currency and inflation of 70%. So in 2018, protests arose around the country, demanding Bashir's resignation. This resulted in a coup d'etat on 11th April 2019, and Omar al-Bashir was removed from government and imprisoned. The Sudanese armed forces later declared a 3-month state of emergency. The Prime Minister, Abdallah Hamdok, signed a political agreement for the creation of a joint military-civilian sovereignty council of Sudan. As of August 2021, the country was jointly led by the chairman of the Transitional Sovereign Council and the head of the Sudanese Armed Forces, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, and Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok. The military-civilian ties began to break as the army refused to cede power. By October 2021, al-Burhan and his deputy, General Hamdan Mdeti Dagalo, jointly carried out a complete military takeover instead of moving to the promised civilian government. And by 2022, Asifa and the Sudanese people marched out in protest to denounce the October 2021 military coup in Khartoum. This led to the Sudanese security forces violently dispersing huge crowds using tear gas and live ammunition. This is known as the Khartoum massacre, and it resulted in Sudan's suspension from the African Union. Little would Asifa have known that it would just be the beginning of another round of violent conflict, even in Khartoum. Hamdok resigned due to the inhumane actions of the military. What it seemed like in the months since the coup in Sudan was virtually the re-establishment of the Bashir regime without Omar al-Bashir. He was not comfortable with the military undoing the vast majority of the reforms and halting the economic progress and financial assistance from the international community. By March 2022, over 1,000 people, including 148 children, had been detained for opposing the coup. By April 2023, power struggles had brewed between Army Commander Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and his deputy, General Hamdan Mdeti Dagalo, head of Paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, an offshoot of the Janjaweed Militia. Their conflict and power tussles erupted into a civil war, with RSF attacking Khartoum with troops, tanks, and planes, and driving Sudan to a state of war. And once again, Asifa would have relived the realities of war and displacement again. Since Sudan has been in and out of civil wars for many years, many non-governmental organizations have been involved in humanitarian efforts to help internally displaced people. But what happens when the humanitarian efforts are frustrated and the workers are attacked? In 2023, the World Food Programme suspended its work in Sudan despite the ongoing hunger afflicting the country, due to the loss of 3 workers in the battles in the streets of Khartoum. Although it may seem like the world is tired of the consistent crisis in Sudan, they haven't entirely given up on them. International officials have warned Sudan of the risk of history repeating itself with another genocide in the Darfur region, especially with the RSF's apparent targeting of black indigenous communities, particularly around the city of El Fasher. Is Sudan ready to listen, or will the power tussle between the two generals continue to blind their eyes? As the saying goes, when 2 elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. Asifa, like most Sudanese, will be on the run again, wondering when it will all end. Together with over 2 million people, she will be forced to flee from the violence in her home. For Asifa, it will be like reliving a memory. Khartoum, once a promising city, is now under siege, falling to ruins after ruins. The crisis in Sudan is not only a power struggle, but a struggle for some of the world's most valued resources, oil and gold. As the crisis deepens, Sudan has once again become one of the world's most desperate regions. It seems like the world is watching to see how far each general is willing to go, waiting with an almost non-existent glimmer of hope for a breakthrough. As for Asifa, she would have wished to return to a normal life, if only she knew what it felt like. It is no longer just about survival, but finding ways to stay alive and thrive amid hardship. This is beyond a story, but a testament to the resilience of the Sudanese who have lived like Asifa. Don't go just yet. Give us a thumbs up if the tragedy of Asifa's story touched you. The world may seem to have had enough of Sudan's endless civil wars, but we must not forget human lives are involved and we can never get tired. Don't forget to subscribe. There's always more. And on that note, I'll be catching you on the next one. Cheers, guys.